much death.
The X-Men 97 season finale was insane, and we have lots of questions, like who sent the X-Men back in time as well as into the future? Where are Morph and Wolverine? And how will this next season tie into the greater multiverse saga? Here's a hint, Kang the Conqueror is behind it all, and we've got the evidence to prove it. Evidence that ties this finale to Loki, Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, and Avengers 5 and Avengers Secret Wars. Welcome back to ScreenCrush, I'm Colton Ogburn, and the X-Men have found themselves displaced in time, and those in the past have come face to face with the very first mutant in Sabanur, aka Apocalypse. But what's even cooler is the mysterious temple lurking in the background, the temple of Rama-Tut, aka the first Kang the Conqueror. As you can see by the rings on this dome-shaped temple, it looks identical to Kang's rings on his time-traveling kingdom in Quantumania, and like Victor Timely's prototype in Loki.
It's a prototype.
And in the comics, Kang's city of Chronopolis was also under a dome. Yet another connection between this series and the MCU's multiverse saga. And of course, we have got to talk about how present-day Apocalypse is about to lead a mutant rebellion and resurrect Gambit as his Horseman of Death, combining the story of Age of Apocalypse with Blood Ties, the comic that I said would be adapted for season 2.
Congratulations, you're a prophet.
Yeah, you throw enough stuff at the wall and something's gonna stick.
What was that?
Nothing, go on.
Okay, so in the final moments of the finale, when the meteorite blips from the sky, we see Rogue, Nightcrawler, Magneto, Beast, and Professor X transported to Egypt 3000 BC. Here they encounter the young mutant in Sabanur.
My name is En Sabanur.
Now, in the comic, The Rise of Apocalypse, we meet a young in Sabanur. During this time, Egypt is being ruled by the pharaoh Rama-Tut. Rama-Tut, who is actually a time-traveling Kang the Conqueror, who is there to claim the young Apocalypse as his heir. In that comic, we see Rama-Tut destroy Sabanur's tribe, and then years later, Sabanur seeks revenge on Rama-Tut and goes to war with his kingdom. And we think that's exactly what we're seeing here in the final moments of this X-Men finale, when we saw Sabanur being attacked by the Pharaoh's guard. In the comics, Sabanur rejects Rama-Tut's offer to become his heir, and he is enraged with him for killing his people. This rage unlocks Sabanur's unmatched mutant powers, and Rama-Tut flees the scene, actually flees the timeline, and goes back to his original point in time. And it was in this comic that they even tied it with the original introduction of Rama-Tut, his first appearance in the 1963 Fantastic Four issue 19. It was in this issue where the Fantastic Four travel to ancient Egypt and encounter Rama-Tut, and Rama-Tut escapes back to his timeline and even has a run-in with Doctor Doom. Now, in the Origins of Apocalypse comic, we get to see the Fantastic Four on the same mission from that comic that had been released 30 years prior. But it looks like that in this adaptation of the story in X-Men 97, it won't be the Fantastic Four who encounter Rama-Tut, but instead, it will be the X-Men. And I think we're going to see something very similar happen here, where Rama-Tut flees the timeline when Apocalypse rises to power. And I think we'll see the X-Men try to help Apocalypse never become the evil mutant that they fought in the future, but inadvertently he will still be set down his villainous path. And you know, one thing that has been especially great about this show is that the X-Men are pinned in so many fronts. They fight evil humans, evil mutants, but they also have to fight a public relations war. This series has always been told through the lens of news broadcasts. Heck, the first image in the very first episode of this series is a news story. Like, for example, when Xavier was discovered to be alive, that should have been a cause for celebration, but instead the media twisted the story to make it seem like the X-Men were the bad guys. The news media often distorts events because of a political or profit bias. They want you to be afraid so you'll keep watching. In fact, these days everyone has an algorithm that filters your news to lean into your existing bias. And that's why it's best for you to know exactly where you are getting your news from. Like Ground News, for instance. Ground News is an app and website that gathers related articles from across the world into one place, but they give you the context about the source's political leaning, their reliability, and their ownership. This means that you can see through the bias and think critically about the news you consume. That's why I'm proud to have them as the sponsor of this video. So let me show you an example. Here's a story about Elon Musk's Neuralink chip.
What's the Neuralink chip?
Yeah, it's like this computer chip that goes in your brain. Here I can see who reported the story, which way they lean politically, the factuality of the story, and whether or not the news came from independent ownership. This story was covered by 65 sources, 17 left, 6 right, and 17 center. I also thought it was interesting that the left-leaning sites call it a malfunction, while Fox News called it a temporary problem. Now, especially with the election coming up, I want to be informed and know that the news isn't trying to sway me one way or the other. They even have a blind spot section that shows you the news stories that each side is ignoring. And by the way, this is all backed by ratings by 3 independent news monitoring organizations. This is an incredible resource, and I have been looking for a service like Ground News for years. I highly encourage you to check them out. So if you go to ground.news/ScreenCrush or click this QR code, you will get 40% off their Vantage plan, which includes unlimited access to every feature. Or you can try their Pro plan for less than $1 a month. Totally worth it. Your subscription will not only help this channel, but you'll also be supporting an independent platform working to make the media landscape more transparent. Now, back to the X-Men. So I think that we're going to see the X-Men attempt to save Ensabanur from becoming Apocalypse and help him take on Rama Tut. And in the future that Scott and Jean have landed in, I think we'll see the X-Men teaming up with a variant of Kang the Conqueror to try and defeat Apocalypse. Because the future they've landed in is an apocalyptic future where Apocalypse is in control, but more on that in a bit. And by the way, this isn't Kang's first appearance in X-Men the Animated Series. In another Apocalypse-centric story from the original series, we learned that the Kang variant Immortus was in hiding all along. Let me explain. So in the X-Men animated series, Apocalypse served as one of the X-Men's key antagonists, and he showed up a few times throughout the series. Now, similar to Thanos, Apocalypse was seeking to destroy the world and recreate it to his liking. So Apocalypse was secretly behind the creation of a device that was marketed as a mutant cure, but in reality, the device was used to turn these mutants into servants of Apocalypse, into his horsemen. Now, Rogue almost takes this cure, but she decides against it in the last minute, whereas Angel, on the other hand, does take the cure and is turned into Archangel.
Worthington is no more. Now there is only Archangel.
Apocalypse is ultimately defeated by the X-Men multiple times throughout the series, and he eventually realizes that these battles are pointless. So instead, he travels back in time on a mission to wipe all psychics from existence, because psychics like Charles Xavier and Jean Grey are the only beings that are able to defeat him. Now, it was during this arc that we are introduced to the Axis of Time, managed by a guy called Bender, who is actually Immortus. Now, like I said, Immortus is a variant of Kang, and he is a character that we've met briefly in the MCU here in this post-credit scene from Quantumania.
They're beginning to touch the multiverse. And if we let them, they will take everything.
So in the comics, Rama Tut, or Kang, is approached by the Timekeepers. Keep in mind that unlike we saw in the MCU with Loki, the Timekeepers actually exist. And hey, they probably used to exist in the MCU as well before being wiped out by He Who Remains. Anyway, in the comics, the Timekeepers offer Rama Tut a job as the preserver of timelines in a realm known as Limbo, also called the Axis of Time. This is a realm without time, and it could also be used as a place to travel through time. Rama Tut then takes on the moniker of Immortus, and he resides in a castle similar to that of the Citadel at the end of time that we saw in Loki. Now, in X-Men the Animated Series, we saw Apocalypse travel to Limbo, or the Axis of Time, using Cable's time travel device. Apocalypse then took over and used this place to kidnap the psychics from throughout all of time. Apocalypse then used the powers of these psychics to erase all of time and rewrite time according to his will.
By harnessing the power of psychic energy, the lines of time have begun to recede.
Apocalypse is ultimately defeated by the X-Men, and the Psychics band together to wipe Apocalypse from existence and from time. After the X-Men return home, we see Bender revert to his true form of Immortus. And of course, it's Immortus and Rama Tut who we saw here in that Quantumania post-credit scene that has yet to be followed up on, perhaps until now, with X-Men 97's season finale. So we've talked a lot about what Marvel is going to do with the character of Kang now that Jonathan Majors is out. Recasting the character would be my preference instead of just abandoning the character, but that Quantumania post-credit scene showing every Kang variant as Jonathan Majors doesn't exactly make recasting all that easy. But perhaps we're seeing a work workaround here with X-Men 97. Perhaps Kang's future lies in the animated realm of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I mean, they did introduce the character in a Disney Plus series with Loki. Why not continue his story in another Disney Plus series like X-Men? Or hey, they could just recast the character with Denzel Washington as an older, future variant of Kang, but hey, I digress. So I gotta say, to all my doubters saying that this series had nothing to do with the multiverse saga in the MCU, my friends, never doubt me.
Wait, so if Apocalypse was wiped from existence, then how did he come back now?
Well, buddy, he actually returned again in the original series in season 5. While his physical form was wiped from time, his astral form remained. And hey, speaking of the return of Apocalypse, be sure to check out our The Apocalypse is Coming shirt up on our merch store right now, ScreenCrushMerch.com. You can also find lots of other X-Men and Deadpool inspired designs up on the store. Shopping our merch store is the best way to support our channel, and we thank you so much for your support. So, Doug, to answer your question, in season 5 of the original series, Apocalypse sends a mutant named Fabian Cortez to find him a new body. When Fabian fails, Apocalypse ends up taking Fabian's body instead as his new vessel. In the comic Blood Ties, which we talked about in this video here, it was Fabian Cortez who leads the mutants of Genosha in a war with the United Nations, and heroes like the Avengers and the X-Men are caught in the middle. Well, in this finale, it was Apocalypse who we see in the ashes of Genosha.
So much death.
This is an Apocalypse who was brought back to life using the body of Fabian Cortez, and I think it's going to be Apocalypse who takes the place of Fabian in this Blood Ties adaptation in a war against humanity. But with Apocalypse in full form, we'll also see the classic story of Age of Apocalypse adapted. And we believe that one of his horsemen will be the resurrected corpse of Gambit taking on the role of Death, which of course was teased here in Xavier's vision a few episodes prior. Okay, so that's the past and the present. In the past, the X-Men will try to redeem Apocalypse and fight Rama Tut, and in the present, we'll see the remaining X-Men band together to take on Apocalypse as he uses the tragedy of Genosha to start a human-mutant war. But what about the future? What's going on with Scott and Jean? And how will these various time periods be tied together? Well, Scott and Jean have found themselves in a future ruled by Apocalypse, and they even encounter a young Nathan Summers, aka Cable, aka their son. This is inspired by the comic The Adventures of Cyclops and Phoenix. Now, in that 4-part story, we saw Scott and Jean pulled into the future by their daughter, Rachel Summers, which is this lady in the hood. You'll learn more about that in season 2. So in those comics, we saw Scott and Jean's minds placed into a different body, and they got to raise Cable, or Nathan. But in this adaptation, it looks like they'll be staying in their own bodies. So perhaps we're going to see time get rewritten. So now the question becomes, how are all these stories going to tie together? Well, I think that when Rama Tut flees the timeline in ancient Egypt, we'll see him go to the present day, and the X-Men will follow him from ancient Egypt, thus leaving the young Apocalypse to go down his villainous path, becoming the Apocalypse of the future. And it's in the future that we'll see a version of Kang, perhaps this guy from Quantumania, convince the X-Men that they need to help him travel back in time to their present day so that they can stop Apocalypse and so that this apocalyptic future doesn't happen. And when these two teams of X-Men and their respective Kang variants arrive in the present, that's when we could see Immortus come in, still running the show, as we saw the last time Apocalypse tried to take over the world in X-Men the Animated Series Season 4. Now, these Kangs could help the X-Men defeat Apocalypse, but in doing so, these Kangs are now able to rise to power because Apocalypse is no longer an obstacle. This could be giving us the origins of the multiversal Council of Kangs that we saw in Quantumania, and laying the groundwork for the X-Men of X-Men 97 to join the fight in Avengers Secret Wars.
But what about Wolverine and Morph?
Oh, we cannot forget about the Lovebirds. So, Wolverine and Morph were also displaced in time, but we didn't see where. And you know what? I'm gonna say it. This Wolverine
Don't say it.
and this Wolverine
Please don't say it.
are the same Wolverine.
And you said it.
Okay, in all seriousness, I do think it would be awesome if these Wolverines were the same. And there has been a lot of evidence to suggest that they are, or that they are at least very similar variants who perhaps once existed as the same being and then splintered into different timelines. Lots of videos up on the channel by yours truly talking about this. But I will acknowledge that this Wolverine is missing his metal claws, which the Deadpool of Deadpool and Wolverine definitely has. And we have to remember that Storm is also missing, and I think we may know where these 3 X-Men went. You see, all of the X-Men landed in an Apocalypse-adjacent time period, and I think Wolverine, Morph, and Storm landed in a period where Apocalypse and Mr. Sinister were working together, a period shortly after Apocalypse bestowed Mr. Sinister with his powers. And it could be this period where we see Mr. Sinister help Apocalypse take over the minds of these 3 X-Men and turn them into his other 3 Horsemen, Storm and Wolverine both having been Horsemen of Apocalypse in the comics. And this would once again place Morph in a situation where he is being manipulated by Mr. Sinister. So guys, those are just my theories. Let me know, do you think that Kang the Conqueror is coming in this next season of X-Men 97? And will this story tie in to the greater multiverse saga? Let me know down in the comments below, or you can @ me on Twitter. And if you're new here, be sure to subscribe, smash that bell for alerts. For ScreenCrush, I'm Colton Ogburn.